One thing I've always been interested in when it comes to video games is what goes into making a likable character. And by that, I don't mean what makes them compelling or complex, although those things can play a factor. I simply mean what makes players like them. In the past, I've talked about some of the ways video games get players to like companions and villains, and now I want to look at the third piece of the puzzle and talk about what goes into making a likable hero. With companions and villains, the focus is on the player forming a relationship with someone else. But with heroes, there isn't that same kind of separation. It isn't a character the player is interacting with. It is one they are interacting as. And being put in control of a character inherently changes the way a player will look at them. Due to video games being an interactive medium, players will always have some sort of influence over how the playable character thinks. This might be in the way they approach the story, or combat, or puzzles, or any other element of the game, big or small. No matter what, the player is part of the protagonist. However, this connection can be tricky to maintain. The general concern a lot of developers seem to have is that if the player becomes detached from the hero for any reason, then they'll be less invested in the game as a whole. When considering that potentially millions of people may play any given title, it makes sense to not want to take that risk. So in response to this, a lot of developers opt to create heroes with either no real personality or a relatively muted one. The idea being that players can more easily project themselves onto the character. Some games do this through a silent protagonist, others allow players to create their own character, and a lot end up having heroes with defining traits that are generally inoffensive. That isn't to say that there aren't video game protagonists with likable personalities. It's just that more often than not, they end up being a little more on the reserved side. It's okay for an NPC to be over the top because the player will have limited interactions with them, but if the protagonist goes too far in any one direction, it can become grating because the player is constantly with them. So we end up getting a lot of protagonists who just feel kind of safe. They're funny, but in a quiet and sarcastic sort of way. They're heroic, but not so heroic that they come off as self-righteous. They're attractive, but forgettably so. They're Nathan Drake, but usually with even less flair. These kinds of heroes have a decent enough personality to set the base for a likable character, but there isn't really enough there to push them to the next level. Fortunately, a character's personality is not the only thing that makes them likable, and given the interactivity of games, developers have some unique tools to build that connection, arguably the most effective of which is how it feels to control the character. Given that this is how players engage most with the protagonist, it plays an important role in shaping how they're viewed. If the player is constantly wrestling with control, or feeling limited by a character's movement speed, or having inputs not work consistently, they'll become justifiably annoyed, and part of that frustration will most likely be directed at the playable character. However, if their movements are fluid and precise, this will build a positive connection. A character who players are excited to play as is one who they'll end up liking more. Consider Spider-Man from Spider-Man. Web slinging around New York City is exciting and fast-paced, and moving from combat to traversal feels seamless. I enjoyed how it felt to be Spider-Man, and because of that, I had a bunch of positive feelings about him as a character. On the other hand, a character like Sonic feels pretty terrible to control in a lot of his games, so I hate him. In a similar vein, a character's animation also affects how players feel about them. A lot can be understood about a character from the way they move around an environment and interact with their surroundings, and when done right, it can make them far more endearing. Whether it be the way Nathan Drake absently puts his hand on walls when walking close to them in the Uncharted series, or how Luigi creeps down corridors with a shiver in his step in Luigi's Mansion, or the various exaggerated expressions shown on Link's face in The Wind Waker, these little touches add a surprising amount of depth to these characters. It's a way to inject personality into them while not pulling the player out of the experience. Where hearing the same kinds of voice lines over and over again can become really annoying, small visual touches never really do, especially if they don't interrupt the action. Honestly, just being able to see a character has a major influence on how likable they are. The limited perspective of first-person titles doesn't offer as many opportunities to show off the personality of the protagonist. Players may get some dialogue from the hero, either filled with thoughts of what's going on or quippy one-liners, but a lot about a character is lost when the only input from them is their voice. Personally, I find when first-person games have cutscenes that show the protagonist, I end up liking them a fair bit more. Even though it's still limited, it helps give a sense for what they're like based on how they look and physically interact with the world and people around them. One of the more effective examples of this is BJ Blazkowicz from the Wolfenstein series. Based on his character design alone, he comes off as a monster of a man who could crush you with his bicep, but through cutscenes and his inner monologues, it's clear that he is a tender and thoughtful individual. There's something endearing about the combination of these seemingly contradictory traits, and that would be lost if the player never had the chance to see him in third person. While all of these touches can highlight likable traits about a protagonist, there are some approaches that aim to build a deeper link between the player and the hero, and they typically center around how the player playable character is framed within the story. Consider Firewatch. The opening section of the game presents the player with a series of choices that chronicles the relationship between the protagonist, Henry, and his wife, Julia. Through this section, players see him fall in love, plan for a future, and then lose it all, as Julia develops early onset Alzheimer's. This opening makes players feel connected to Henry not only because they made choices for him, but also because they witnessed the best and worst moments of his life. And regardless of who he is, experiencing that with him is endearing. Firewatch uses empathy to get players to relate to and like Henry. And as it turns out, this is one of the most effective ways to build a connection. And when done right, it doesn't even really matter whether or not the hero has a likable personality. It just matters that players see them from a certain perspective. Take Joel from The Last of Us. While he has a bit of that good old Southern charm and does act as a protector for other characters players care about, it's hard for me to call him likable. He's cold and distant, and he also brutally kills a lot of people, many of whom don't deserve it. However, I found myself liking him throughout the majority of the playthrough, and that's because within the first 20 minutes of the game, I witnessed the worst moment of Joel's life. I liked Joel because I thought I knew Joel. I experienced his loss alongside him and felt like I understood him because of it. This led to me excusing a lot of his actions in the name of his trauma, so much so that it wasn't until just before the end that I realized, oh yeah, this is very not good. The game is set up in a way where players will have a lot of patience for Joel. They've seen what he's gone through. They've seen how he has changed because of it. But also, they see that there is hope of him becoming a better man. Which, yeah, doesn't happen, but all of this did get me to like him up until the point where it was clear that he couldn't be redeemed. Of course, the effectiveness of this approach really depends on how well it is presented. The God of War series has been trying to get players to empathize with Kratos since the first game, but given the depth of his depravity, along with him being pretty terrible even before anything happened to his family, the series' early attempts always kind of missed the mark. With that said, the previous shortcomings did set a good foundation for God of War 2018, which starts off with Kratos losing his wife. Only this time, instead of seeking a way to unleash his anger, he sets out with his son to fulfill her final request. For players new to the series, he's endearing because his grief is relatable, and for players who are already familiar with the character, this shift in the way he responds to loss shows his capacity for change, helping to reset some of the lingering opinions about his past indiscretions. While it can certainly run the risk of aggravating a portion of the audience, redemption is a solid way to get players to like a protagonist. It makes it so the hero can be a little more rough around the edges, but also it gives people a reason to root for them. Like Lee Everett from The Walking Dead and John Marston from Red Dead Redemption. Both are characters who have done terrible things in their past, and the player is introduced to them at the exact moment where they're forced to confront those things. While both games provide multiple ways for each character to find redemption, by leaving room for them to become better people, it gives players the chance to grow a connection with them and be endeared by their change. Most of what I've talked about so far are ways that games aim to make protagonists likable to a wide audience. But I think it's worth mentioning that some of the most likable heroes are the ones who aren't meant to appeal to everyone. People connect to characters who they relate to. And while there are plenty of ways to present a character so that they appeal to more people, there is something to be said for a protagonist who only appeals to some. Characters like Max from Life is Strange, whose indecisiveness manifests as a game mechanic, or May from Night in the Woods, whose lack of drive continually gets in her way, can be irritating to people who don't relate to those pressures. But as someone who very distinctly does, I found both of them to be extremely endearing. Specificity has the potential to create the strongest bond between a player and protagonist. And while I understand why many games opt to have heroes who are for everyone, those kinds of characters won't have the same level of profound relatability because they're too general. Ultimately though, what matters most about a hero isn't if they're likable or not. What matters is that they improve the experience of the game. Some titles are written in a way that benefits from having a nondescript hero, while others would make no sense without a predefined protagonist. While I personally prefer when games create playable characters with distinct traits that won't be relatable to everyone, I imagine I'll mostly have to stick to indie games for that. With that said, I respect why a lot of developers aim to make heroes that will appeal to the largest amount of people. At the end of the day, they're trying to make money, so they want their games to be as easy to get into for as many folks as possible. Given that the protagonist is how players interact with the game, that sometimes means having a hero that appeals to the lowest common denominator. I just wish that so many of them weren't so boring. Hey, thanks for watching. If you'd like to hear my voice more often, I have been streaming over on Twitch, so go check out my channel. I pretty much play games that I know I'll eventually talk about on YouTube, and I have plans in the future to do streams with other friends, playing board games and some tabletop games, and also doing some streams with the lady I live with once she is not the busiest person in the world. So yeah, the link for that is in the description. For some more content, check out the Patreon, where you can get a monthly Q&A podcast and also an extra video each month that's pretty much a highlight reel of my wife playing various games for Gaming for a Non-Gamer. Link for that is in the description as well. That's all I've got. I hope you have a great day and or night. I'll see you in the next one.